Hello and welcome back to the Scenario 7 podcast. My name is Sam, and this week I'm only joined by Joe. Joe, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, Sam. How are you? How are you?
I am.
Oh,
I'm all right. I'm feeling a bit under the weather, and that is also why Josh isn't here. Josh is feeling not great with his. I think we've got a flu thing. We both went to a festival this weekend, and we've both ended up having similar things, but his is a lot worse than mine. So yeah, he's not here, but it's right because it's going to be me and Joe giving you insight into a what a fantastic race it was. It was sensational, like thrilling racing from start to finish. But yeah, we of course talk about the Belgian Grand Prix. We're going to be reviewing whatever that was, talk about qualifying, and then talking about Sunday, not even dignifying calling it the race. But yeah, first of all, Joe, give me your general thoughts about what happened this weekend.
I thought it was pretty much of a shambles in a way in terms of I would say it's quite hard on the FIA, but I think they could have easily put the race for tomorrow. I don't know if it was still raining today, but the weather conditions apparently looked a lot better. But I don't think it was a bank holiday in Belgium, and then obviously that means there won't be enough marshals. So yeah, it's I don't as we'll probably get onto it. I think the race wasn't even a race; it was 3 minutes long, the shortest Grand Prix ever, and probably will stay like that because of the new rule they're putting in. But the qualifying, I think, was probably the most interesting one this season because it as in probably get into Eau Rouge is probably one of the most dangerous corners, but probably if the driver takes the risk, they can gain a lot because of the momentum up the straight. But yeah, it's again, qualifying was probably the best part of this weekend.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's definitely the best part. Let's talk about qualifying. Let's start with Q1. Not many highlights from Q1 necessarily. It was it was the people that normally go out went out. Norris looked very quick in Q1, which was a theme that he carried into Q2 and did look like a potential pole sitter when we'll talk about what happened in a bit, but yeah, didn't happen. And I think really the only big thing from Q1 was that Nicholas Latifi, he got out of it. He got into Q2, and what form Nicholas Latifi's in? He's going to be in the he's surely going to be in the Mercedes seat before long. I mean, unbelievable. Joe, what do you think about Q1?
I think Latif is quite interesting because there's a lot of a lot of hints from I forgot what the manager's name is, the directive, whatever, I don't know what you call it, who does all the Williams stuff. I think Latifi apparently will be signed on for next season, which is actually starting to show some kind of speed, which I think if the rumors are not true, I think he needs to carry that up into I think it's Netherlands next week, and then it's Monza. So I think Latifi's got a very good chance of staying in that Williams seat when I would say like 4 races ago he looked dead and buried, probably to get replaced by maybe Bottas or De Vries from who's the world champion, from Formula E. So yeah, I think Latifi did his job, I would say, and very solid qualifying, and could have got into Q3 if the weather conditions were right at the time.
Yeah, no, he certainly did a fantastic job. I mean, Q2 was more exciting, but not as much necessarily happened. I'll talk about Latifi again. He outqualified Sainz, Alonso, and Stroll, which is pretty crazy in a Williams. So did a great job. And then, of course, got moved up after the penalties, which we'll talk about in a bit. But I think the highlight of Q2 was Lance Stroll kind of got his team basically messed up massively because he had a 5-second penalty anyway because of the Hungary incidents, which is warranted, fair enough. So he had a 5-place grid penalty, and the team completely messed up, and he couldn't get out in time for a second lap. So without the penalty, he finished in 15th, and so he started. He would have started the race in 20th. So frustrating, certainly for Stroll. But throughout this year, I think in the races he's been pretty solid. However, he has struggled in qualifying quite a bit.
Yeah, he's been, I would say, quite disappointing. And if you're talking about, I wouldn't say, I don't think he's going to move from that seat very well. Until Lance Stroll is out of that Aston Martin. But yeah, I honestly think he needs to pick up his qualifying because of the fact that he's got decent race pace, but Aston Martin also need to do their part, which they have done very stupid decisions like the Vettel incident. Apparently they haven't given back the trophy yet, but yeah. And then also the fact that, yeah, I don't know, just Stroll, it just needs to find that pace. And I think he's usually quite good at the slow speed circuit. So it'd be interesting to see what happens at the Netherlands Grand Prix with Stroll.
Yeah, totally. I mean, this was definitely a team error, but qualifying this year for him hasn't been amazing. Let's move on to Q3 where all the action happened. First of all, let's talk about Lando. We talked about him about how quick he was in Q1 and he was very quick in Q2. The drivers got sent out when they shouldn't have been sent out. It was way too wet. They should have waited for a different window, and Lando Norris paid the price for that, really. He caused a red flag. He crashed going Eau Rouge, which was just ridiculously wet at the time. And it could have been a really bad incident. You know, it was the wet going at the pace he was up Eau Rouge. He then got rebounded back across the track. So if someone was behind him, you maybe using a slipstream on his lap or something, it could have been a much worse incident. Luckily, he walked out with it with no injuries really, and he was cleared to race on Sunday. But it was nice to see Sebastian Vettel going over to see if it was okay, making sure, put the thumbs up. But first of all, the thing I want to talk about is this was an FIA mistake here, wasn't it? They should have waited to send the drivers out.
I can understand why they let it run, and because of the fact it's just the conditions were so changing. And I remember Malaysia, I think in 2011, it was basically a monsoon and they still qualified there. And I remember Button, Vettel, I think even like Weather and Alonso all did, but yeah, basically crashed out. And then obviously the red flag. I think that gets the point where the FIA need to make a decision before, for example, Norris incident, and obviously the ones I can remember in Malaysia, before it turns into a red flag situation. And if you have Vettel, who's very experienced, and then Norris saying, "Oh, a bit aquaplaning," and then you got Vettel saying, "Oh, this is ridiculous," and all that stuff. And then I think I remember Ricardo saying something. They're like, "Oh, this is getting a bit sketchy." So yeah, it's a clear FIA mistake, but is some understanding why they would do it. But I don't know. It's a very difficult one because we're not actually racing in an F1 car.
Yeah, but you brought up Malaysia then, how that possibly could have been similar. Malaysia doesn't have an Eau Rouge. Eau Rouge is one of the most dangerous corners on the Formula One grid. The high speed we've seen, of course, Hubert recently died there. Literally every or the first 2 days of the weekend. On Friday, we saw a massive crash there with six in the W Series with six cars. Admittedly, they didn't have the problem of rebounding onto the track. Luckily, they all stayed in the same place, but that was a horrific horrific crash. Norris's incident getting rebounded across the track could have been worse. Eau Rouge is a very dangerous corner, and I think that should have been more in the FIA's mind when deciding to send them out, because in Q1 and Q2 it wasn't as wet as it was in Q3. It's when they were sent out, it was clearly worse. Experienced drivers like Vettel were saying, we should wait, we shouldn't go out in this, but they decided to press on with it. Lando had a terrible accident, and it was just not really good enough. I don't think the FIA had a great weekend this weekend, and I think that's pretty fair to say, but surely they should have looked at Eau Rouge, looked at the history of it, and thought, yeah, I don't think this is safe.
I think it's hard. I remember listening to Martin Brundle saying when that happened, saying that these drivers are, I don't know, probably because it's very old fashioned, the way that they just didn't have any safety in those times. I think in the 1980s, but it was literally they're perceived as like gladiators and basically going to war on track in a way that they can do up Eau Rouge. I think Norris went slightly wide, that meant the angle is a bit narrow, which then causes his car to pirouette. But yeah, it's I think F1 have to be very careful not to make the sport watered down into kind of a single seater driving with loads of runoff, like France, for example, which has ridiculous runoff. And then, yeah, those sort of tracks, does F1 really want to turn into that and not have any danger element to it? But again, there's as you said, Hubert and the W Series there's a lot of risk to it. But yeah, I think that's the FIA have to evaluate that corner very carefully, because they need to consider the fact it needs to be challenging but also safe at the same time, which yeah
I think there isn't really much they can do with it. I don't think they should necessarily get rid of it. I think it's such an iconic corner, it should stay as a part of the sport, but they need to do something with the barriers or something, because at the moment cars are hitting it and rebounding onto track, which is causing danger to other people who haven't necessarily either made a mistake or lost it or something. They need to think about something. Maybe pushing the barriers back isn't possible because of certain logistical things, but they certainly need to go. They need to go to France. They need to get their blue and red sticky tape thing that they have, which slows cars down, slowing the momentum, and basically plaster it all over the side, because at the moment cars are hitting it, and then the momentum is continuing, and they're hitting and they're coming across the track. If they bought in this, then maybe they'd go off the track, they'd start slowing down because of the tape or whatever it is, I don't know what the scientific term for it, hitting the barrier, and then again, it's still on this tape being slowed down. So perhaps maybe the momentum would have stopped to keep them off the racing line, or just to keep them safe. I mean, I don't know if that's possible. I'm just proposing something, but I do think that they need to do something. The corner they should keep, but it certainly is something to do with the runoff, and I think that is crucial. moving on to a lighter element of Q3, let's talk about George Russell. I mean, admittedly, what happened to Lando was terrible. But then when they went back out, they had a long break. The rain calmed down a bit. The track wasn't as wet. And George Russell put in a storming lap. It was unbelievable. George Russell qualified P2, which is obscene. He was on provisional pole until Max Verstappen put a lap in. He beat Hamilton convincingly. And this is in a car which, until last week, hasn't been getting results. Admittedly, he's been able to put some great qualifying finishes in throughout the season and a few last season. And this is definitely going to enhance the name Mr. Saturday, because he's basically just got himself his first podium because of the qualifying. But this was unbelievable. I was working during qualifying and at a football game at Brighton Everton, and I came back into the press box at half time to see the end. I came in as I saw a Williams parking in P2, and I literally just squealed in the press box and just went, "Oh my gosh, Russell's P2" out loud. Everyone's looking at me. I'm just there, like, really awkwardly, like, yeah. And I just couldn't believe it. I was like completely in shock. And what a lap it was. I mean, how, Joe, summarize how amazing that lap from George Russell was.
It was utterly amazing. I think it brings the question up: is it going to be a lineup Hamilton, Russell for Mercedes next season? I think it's quite hard to judge, just because the conditions are very much, you have to be there at the right place, right time, and that's also credit to the Williams team as well for putting him on the right. The right part of the track where the rain was less. And then I think it got heavier at some point, because Hamilton did not look comfortable in those conditions where he usually excels at in the wet, which I was very surprised about. I honestly don't think that Mercedes is particularly good for some reason, but yeah, Russell is surprising me, but I think the one thing I would say about Q3 that annoys me is Norris potentially not getting that pole, and then that would have been the win. I'm gonna call it. But it's the way it's the way it works, but.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly been an ongoing theme throughout the season. We've been talking about who's going to have that Mercedes seat next year. Is it going to be Russell? Is it going to be Bottas? Russell has done nothing wrong this season. He literally has done everything he can to get that seat. He has been superb. And now putting a Williams at P2 in treacherous conditions where we've seen excellent drivers like Charles Leclerc didn't get into Q3. We've seen Alonso didn't get in Q3. Some really experienced, some great drivers struggled. And this guy who's been in Formula One, I think this is third year. I might be wrong.
Yeah.
But, third year of Formula One, and he's just put a Williams, which, in my opinion, is the second worst car on the grid. Maybe now it's the third worst. Maybe it's jumped Alfa Romeo with the finishes, but I still believe the Alfa Romeo car is better than how they've been performing. He's just put that car on P2 and he's got himself a podium. For me, I know Bottas I think he's overly criticised. He hasn't had a great season, but he's a great support driver. But for me, it's now a no-brainer. I think that George Russell has to get that seat because he just did unbelievable. Like, just this weekend alone, he deserves it. He was sensational.
Yeah, I think the only reason that Mercedes would keep Bottas on is for the team chemistry. And I do agree it gets over criticized just due to the fact that you compare him, Bottas is getting compared to probably one of like the top 5 greatest drivers of all time. I think if you put Bottas against Schumacher, I think we're having the same conversation. If you put Bottas against, I don't know, like Ellen Senna, for example, you're going to get these same conversations like Barrichello against Schumacher. Why Barrichello was a very good driver, but was outshone massively, making Barrichello look absolutely rubbish. So I kind of hope Bottas goes to a different team because he's, I think, getting mugged around a bit in the way that he's perceived in the media and also to the fans, but also to try and get some confidence back up and also build a team around him being the main man, him having his own driving, as in like the car suiting his driving style, rather than it seems to suit Lewis, which I think Mercedes have compensated it so to try and make it suit Bottas, but I think it's probably the right time for Bottas to leave in order to rebuild his career up in F1. I think he will be in F1 because he's probably still a top 5 or top. I wouldn't say. I think it's quite hard to say who's the fastest, but he is in the top 10 drivers on the grid. So for me, he has to get a seat, which it looks like is either be at Williams or Alfa Romeo.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where he ends up. Now, let's move on from qualifying. Let's talk about Sunday. Let's start off before the race. We had Sergio Perez crashing on the outlap. Of course, he did end up having his car fixed, which ended up being in vain because he would have started 20th. The race didn't happen anyway. So he got no points. First of all, I love Perez. I'll defend him to the hills. But a driver as experienced as Checo shouldn't really be crashing on an outlap, should he? Even if the conditions as what they were.
Yeah, it's. I would say being quite naive in the way that he was driving. As it looked like he was driving really slowly, but I think you have to be extra careful. Because if for some reason he went over a curb, which in the wet it's basically suicidal to do that because you're going to end up skidding over the paint, which he did, then cause him to go into the barrier. And then I think it was quite weird the fact that Perez was allowed back in the race, and if he was, then because the time, I think we'll talk about this, the time was still going because of the 3-hour time slot, he probably should effectively be a lap down, in my opinion, because the race basically started when the safety car was doing a couple of laps, and then obviously the red flag happened and we had to wait for 5 hours before we got some 2-lap running, I'm gonna say.
Yeah, I mean, the FIA kind of just, I feel like overruled a few of their rules this weekend. Realistically, whether he just started a lap down or not, it doesn't matter. He got no points anyway, so it didn't really affect him. But I think it was slightly naive. It was really frustrating for me. I was so frustrated, but at the end of the day, the whole week, this rest of Sunday was a complete farce. And so they tried to get going twice. They sent them out at the time they were meant to, but both times they came back in. And to be honest, I feel like they only sent them out a second time to get a race classification. And I don't particularly think that was right. I don't know what you thought about it. Do you think that the second time they took them out because they actually thought they could get going, or do you think that they went out just to get a race classification?
I don't think it was for like, if people are saying it's for like sponsorship and money. I don't think it's for that. I was think it's from looking at it that you got potentially one race going. So that would be 22 races that we had. If you take out Belgium, that would be 21, I think, or 20. I can't actually remember. So you're taking races out. So then you're making, it might be due to money, because the fact is that the sponsors probably paid to have 22, between 22 races or 23, but then obviously COVID and that might put a kind of clause in it. But I don't know. It seems a bit stupid to classify qualifying when they probably could have done maybe a sprint after qualifying. Maybe that would have been, because I think remember Christian Horner saying that even the F2 finished at like 7 o'clock Central Time, European time. So it swings around about. But I hope the rule that they're changing will make it that the fact that you have to do more than 2 laps to make it a classification, because that, I think, again, I think the fans should be refunded and all that stuff, but I don't think it's a money driven thing. I think it's just due to the fact, just to say they've done, how many races are we on now? I think it's 11.
About halfway. I'm not
Yeah.
sure. I'm
So
not sure.
so if just to say, oh, we done 11 rounds, rather than saying, oh, one's cancelled because of the wet weather in Spa, I think it's just generally, just as you said, just to put a classification in, which is wrong, but I think we just have to deal with it and move on.
Yeah. It was certainly frustrating. The new rule changes, have to be put in place to ensure this never happens again. The fact that the rule was more than two or more means you get points, or you get half points. Less than 75% means you get half points, is a bit stupid. They definitely need to look at it. The whole weekend realistically was a complete mess. That not all the blame has to go on the FIA. I mean, the weather was ridiculous. It was tough conditions, but the FIA should be doing better. Fans, if they're not funded, that's a disgrace, and it's not really their duty. But I'd like to see some drivers maybe club together to help try and refund the fans, because they need to do something. They have to do something, because it was ridiculous. And if Hamilton or Verstappen, for example, win the championship by half a point, there will be outrage. I mean, that's a possibility now, because we see half points now. You've got decimal places in the points tally. I mean, first of all, in terms of the layout of the table, they're going to have to make the columns wider, which is probably the least of their worries. But if Verstappen or Hamilton win the championship by half a point, they'll be outraged, because realistically, nobody should have got points there.
Yeah, that's the big issue. And I remember somebody saying on Twitter that if Mercedes, I think if a team guy puts it to the FIA, why did you do it? It's basically against their own rules that they put in. I think, as in Martin Brundle was saying, that the teams get their own rules that extend from the rule book the media get. So it will be quite interesting to see what happens in the next week or so. If somebody appeals for that, like points to get denied, be quite gutting for George Russell and Latifi. But yeah, it's I completely agree with you on the fact that if Hamilton wins by half a point, or Max wins by half a point, it's going to be a very weird feeling, and also big questions asked about how the points should actually be dealt with in order to not have these half points.
Yeah.
Maybe round it up, as in make it a bit more.
Yeah, but rounding up would cause its own issues, because then you'd have several people on the same amount of points. For example, Latifi, who ended up with one, he ended up with, oh no, not Latifi. For example, Latifi ended up with one, but then it'd mean the guy in 10th with 0.5, who was, I've forgotten who's come 10th. Latifi, no, not Latifi. I'm
Was
reading
it
my note.
Science?
I think it was Science. Yeah, you're right. It was Science. He would also get 1 point, so you'd have two drivers on the same point. So I'm not really sure that that would work. But yeah, they should have got no points. It's frustrating that a lot of fans watched for so long for nothing to happen. People saying they should have just gone out and raced. You have races like Spa in 1998, where they raced in similar conditions, so many crashes, so many injuries. It was a complete mess. They couldn't have raced. The conditions were not good enough to race. When they sent them out a second time, the conditions were worse than when they would have come out the first time. So they were never going to race when they went out again. So in my opinion, that was only for race classification.
I think for me, they should have raced on the first one, and if there's a red flag, there's a red flag. As in the fact of people, if people actually aquaplane, as in you've seen, like for example, Canada, I think in 2011 when Jenson Button won it, it was a 4-hour race. It was like a 2-hour delay on that. I think they could have easily done that if there was only 7 laps, for example. It's better than having 2 laps, and they can. There's more justification for saying half points for 7 laps than 2 laps, in my opinion. But
yeah, I think the issue with that is, though, that the first 2 laps of the race are the most dangerous, because the field is at its most bunched together, and racing in those conditions, in my opinion, would have been idiotic, and someone could have easily lost their life. Someone could have easily got hospitalized. I just don't think there was any way they could have raced, but then they should have gone home with all of them 0 points. I know it's frustrating. I felt like I was owed money having stayed the whole time, even though I could have easily turned over. And that was my personal choice, never mind the fans that were there. But one of the biggest victims of the weekend was Lando Norris. I mean, he literally got wrecked by the FIA on Saturday and Sunday. Everything that went wrong, that could have gone wrong, kind of went wrong. We had, first of all, the driver's being sent out in stupid conditions. He almost gets badly hurt, crashes, and so he can't put a lap in. He could have potentially got pole. That's the first thing. Second thing, admittedly, it's the rules and it's the correct rules. However, the FIA's rules gave him a 5-place grid penalty for a gearbox change. The FIA, something they've put in, has screwed him again. Admittedly, I mean, it's the right thing to do, but it was pretty unfortunate. And then on the Sunday, he doesn't get a chance to get into the points because there's no race, and his rivals who qualified in the top 10 do get points. So throughout the weekend, Lando just had a nightmare. He was falling asleep in between the sessions. And for me, the highlight of Sunday was a Red Bull mechanic falling over a chair, which really sums up how Sunday went. And I don't really know what else to say about it, really. Do you have anything to add about Sunday?
I think the one thing I would say about especially Lando Norris is the fact that I think it's nice to see that as a British fan, that you got another, I would say, wet weather master, like driving that we could have seen if it was inters from Lando Norris, if he could have probably got pole. I would actually say he probably could have easily won. He could have potentially won the race. I think that was the most disappointing part of it. It's the fact that he didn't know what his potential was. But yeah, as you said, I'm very surprised they didn't take an engine, just as in like a new engine, so they get obviously the back of the grid, so that they take the engine, and so that they don't have an extra engine they could use further on down into the season. I think they could have been teams capitalizing on the mistakes of the FIA for actually having this as a race classification and just snuck an engine in after qualifying. I think that would have been quite interesting to see what the other teams would have said if any of the teams did that. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the final thing I really want to say is that there are some drivers we haven't really talked about here. I want to highlight, Sebastian Vettel for his going to check Lando was okay. Not only was that great, but he also qualified fifth, did really well. Ricciardo qualifying fourth, having a tough time recently, but had a great qualification. Gasly in sixth. So there are some drivers that I just want to highlight. Latifi, who we've mentioned, that also had great weekends and got some reasonably good points. But at the end of the day, no one should have got points. Finally, driver of the weekend. We can't really call it driver of the day because nothing really happened on the Sunday. But yeah, who is your driver of the weekend?
I'm going to go for Lando Norris. Just even though he crashed, it was a tiny mistake, I would say. Going him kind of being inexperienced, underestimating. Well, I wouldn't say underestimating, but underestimating how wet it was, even though that he shouldn't have been out. But also due to the fact that Lando Norris also had the potential of getting pole. He was a lot quicker than Max Verstappen and also Lewis Hamilton, and I ultimately believe that he would have got pole, and as I said previously, could have won the race. So that's the reason I've put Lando Norris. But you could have put George Russell and Latifi into that mix as well.
Yeah, certainly. Well, I am going to give my driver of the day to George Russell. I mean, he deserves to be. He. There's been a long time where he's deserved a podium. What happened in Bahrain? Admittedly, my driver Perez won it, so I was really happy. But it was really unfortunate for him. Every time he's been near a podium or near something great, something bad happens. So it'd be nice. It's nice that he has finally got some good luck and that he's actually been given his first podium. He's got himself a second place. He's got himself some great points for the team. And I'm really happy for him. Latifi, as well as you mentioned, also fantastic. And the drivers I mentioned earlier, Ricciardo and Vettel, could have also been in that. But yeah, I only give it to George Russell because sensational drive on Saturday. And he's going to get that Mercedes seat next year. But yeah, that pretty much sums up our review on the farce of a weekend in Spa. But yeah, thank you if you've listened the whole time. Thank you for watching as well. Remember to like, subscribe. Remember to just interact with all our platforms. Next race is Zandvoort. We will have a preview for that. Zandvoort will literally be on Sunday, so there won't be much time between this review and the preview. So lots of content coming this week for you guys. But thank you, Joe, for joining me and giving us some insight.
Yeah. Oh wow. Hopefully, Josh his immune system will start kicking in.
Yeah. Hopefully he'll be back for the preview. But yeah, thank you for watching and listening, and we'll see you soon. Thank you, guys.